Hello, my bells and bats. My name is Sheena Peril. I am a knitwear designer and novelist from the Pacific Northwest. And on this channel, we talk about writing, knitting, sewing, pretty much anything creative that I'm working on. There are cats that will interrupt from time to time. And also our lighting is wonky today because that's winter in the Pacific Northwest. I hope that you will excuse the lighting. I've done the best I can with it. It's just, I don't have a lot of daylight to work with, and this is the angle of the sun that I have at the moment. It will probably disappear by the end of this video. So today I wanted to talk to you about patterns. I've noticed that I don't really use patterns. As I said, I do design my own knitwear. But I know that compared to a lot of other podcasts, they talk in depth about patterns and what they think of them. They follow specific designers, and that's not my bag, obviously. So I did post a poll on the community tab last week, or a couple of weeks ago, asking if that was something that mattered to you, if you wanted to see more patterns designed by other people, or if you were more interested in the design process, or if there was just something else that you were looking for in a knitting podcast. The results of that poll are not going to affect my content in any way. That was just curiosity on my part. So I wanted to walk you through how I start a project and why I don't use patterns pretty much ever. I do occasionally use them if I am trying to learn a new skill, but I typically just don't use them. That's not the way my brain works. So this isn't a tutorial necessarily, it's just how I do it, and I have internalized a lot of this process over the years. So one caveat that I should say, I've been crocheting since I was 8, I've been knitting since I was 18, and in between there I also learned how to sew. I sewed a lot from patterns and learned about construction that way. I did take a college level sewing construction course, and that has impacted how I knit. So I learned about the dimensions of garments and how the pattern pieces fit together in sewing land, and a lot of that does translate to knitting world. The other thing is just that I have a lot of practice doing this, and I can give you some tips on how to do it, but it's not something that you can just sit down and do usually unless you have that background knowledge and that practice. I'm also going to tell you that I frog a lot of projects. I start them over and over again, like I did with the Wednesday vest. I've shared some of my swatches for that, and I think I went through about 6 iterations before I actually cast on what became the final vest. So this isn't a step 1, step 2, step 3 process. A lot of it is just things that I do instinctively, and I can tell you that you don't have to do a ton of external math for this. If you have a feel for how a garment is constructed, and if you can read your knitting, then you can do this. Those are the main 2 requirements, but you do have to have some kind of experience in how the patterns fit together. You need to know the different stitch types and what they look like, and have an idea of your measurements and ease and what type of fit you're looking for. So, all of that being said, like I said, I started I started crocheting when I was 8. So at that point, I've mentioned before, I had a very isolated upbringing until I was about 16, and even up into my 20s when I finally moved out of my parents' house. So I didn't have access to a lot of things. This was pre-Ravelry. I didn't have an allowance or income of my own until I was 16, and then it mostly just covered things like gas. So I couldn't go out and buy patterns, and I had very limited access to the library until I was about 14. So what I would do is I would go to the library every Thursday night when my dad was at the bar, and I would read books. And I read a lot of different books, but I also spent a lot of time reading knitting books. Particularly, I'm interested in knitting history, but I also flipped through a lot of pattern books, and I looked at schematics, and I looked at the way different sweaters were constructed and the stitch patterns and how they were used, and tried to get a feel for how I could do that on my own. Because number one, I didn't have money to make copies. And number two, I knew that I would not be able to finish a project before the book had to be returned. So I didn't want to take the book home and risk something happening to it or having it be overdue. So I would just sit there in the library and look at these patterns, and then I could be like, oh, okay, I just need to make this shape and it's this texture, and that's the way I do it. The other thing is that I did not learn how to read patterns until the post-Ravelry days. So I was mostly just winging it. If you handed me a knitting pattern, I had no idea what to do with it. I didn't have any knitting friends. My mom had never used a pattern before, so it was just completely foreign to me. It was like handing me a book in German and asking me to translate it. I knew what some of the terms were, but I didn't know what they meant in context. So that is why I didn't start out using patterns. And overall, I think that was really good for me because it made me more creative as a knitter, and it made me more of a problem solver. And I learned a lot more about garment construction that way. So really, I've been designing knitwear and crochet pieces since I was about 8, but I didn't start writing down my patterns until after I was in college and after Ravelry came out, because self-publishing a pattern was a completely new concept to me. And at first I was just writing down patterns for my own use, and I'd be like, oh, well, I figured out how to do this thing. I'll post it on Ravelry and maybe somebody else will have fun doing this thing. And that kind of exploded. I had a pattern that went kind of viral. So I also, at the time, I was doing a lot of what I call party trick knitting. So that's things like illusion knitting, entrelac, stuff that looks really complicated when you first glance at it, but then when you sit down and know the process, it's actually quite simple. Illusion knitting is just alternating stripes, and all you're doing is manipulating purl stitches to create a pattern that is viewable when you look at it on an angle. Entrelac, it's just short rows. That's all it is. So in doing that, I learned a lot, and I had some clever ideas. And I knit the same way that I write, which is I make the things that I want that I don't see in the world already. So let's start out with the way that I handle this process. Usually I will see a picture or I'll get an idea for something. So I either start with a picture that I have found online or in a magazine, and then I will go, or I'll have an idea for something, and I will go to my sketchbook and start sketching it out. My sketchbook is currently AWOL at the moment, otherwise I would show you. But I'll do things like I will sketch out, if I have an idea for a specific colorwork pattern, I will sketch out that colorwork pattern in the sketchbook, get an idea of what colors I want to use, what shapes, and then I will transfer it to knitter's graph paper, which I'll show you in a second. If it's a picture from the internet, then I'll sketch it out and I will draw where any seams are. If there are seams that I can add or remove to make the construction easier for myself, I make pretty much everything seamlessly because I don't like seaming. So I'll make changes to, basically I'm creating a schematic for myself of how this garment or this object is going to be constructed. And I'll do arrows to show myself what direction the knitting is supposed to go in, where specific textures are supposed to go, if there's a seam line, where that seam is going to go. And I can show you some pictures here, because once I finish in the sketchbook, I move it to my knitting journal. And my knitting journal is my knitting journal is where sort of the final sketches go. And what I'm using is basically a happy planner. This is actually a tulle notebook that I got on clearance from like an Office Depot or something that was going out of business. And this has a lot in it. If you want to see the inside, I can give you a flip through, but it's very messy right now because I have a couple of long-term projects going. So I have a lot of different notes that I'm going back and forth between. So I will show you the final project or show you a flip through if that's what you want to see, just not in this moment. Okay, so here is one example. This is the Outlander cape that I'm working on for Ash. And what I did when I started doing this is I looked up a bunch of different photos online. I just searched for Claire Outlander cape or Claire Outlander knitwear. I found a couple of photos, and because they were screen grabs, they weren't all that clear on the construction of the garment. So then I went to Ravelry because it's Outlander. I know that somebody has worked up this pattern before. I found one that was pretty much what I wanted. And just from the photos, I could tell what the construction was. So I looked at it and I sketched out this image. So you can see here, I have marked out where the border stitches are going, which are going to be in a different stitch. I have marked out where my increases are going, how far down they're going. And then this section right here has information on my measurements, what type of stitches I'm using. If I have a resource that I found online that I want to be able to go back to as I'm working on this, then I will bookmark it and write that source down in my notebook. And I also write down information just like you would in a Ravelry page. So I write down what yarn I'm using, how much, the color, and I also put down my needles that I'm using. And in this case, I changed needles twice through the project. So I started with a 4, went to a 6, and went to an 8. And then I also wrote down why I made those changes in this notebook. So from this stage, depending on how complicated the project is, I might write down a basic pattern for myself, or just like a recipe, like, you know, knit 4 inches of ribbing and then 6 inches of stockinette stitch, split for the sleeves, and then yada, yada, yada on from there. In this case, for the capelet, I didn't, because it was a very simple project. One project that I did do that for was the Ellie Nora stockings, and that's why this notebook is so messy, because it's a very involved project and I have a lot of notes. So here I've got my diagram of what stitch patterns I'm using. I highlighted where I'm putting in any decreases or increases. And then in the following pages, I've written down what I did each day so that I can turn that into a pattern later on. Here, once I got to a section where I knew roughly what was coming next, I was able to write out the instructions for each pattern repeat and what changes needed to be made. And then I would check those off as I completed those pattern repeats so I could keep track. The knitter's graph paper, you can find this just by searching for knitter's graph paper online. You can use regular graph paper. However, knitter's graph paper is slightly different dimensions. It's not made up of squares, it's made up of rectangles. So if you use regular graph paper in your patterns, then you need to be aware that the proportions are different. So on regular graph paper, if you knit an image, it's going to be elongated. When it's in knitter's graph paper, it's going to actually appear how it will in the knitting. So this is what knitter's graph paper looks like. You can see a couple of sketches that I started and abandoned, and then here I had the final sketch, which I then cut out and pasted into the pattern page that I created for that garment. And this is just something, this was downloaded from the knittingsite.com via tidyforms.com. And it's just a basic grid. And what's really nice about this one is that each of these larger grids is 5 stitches by 5 stitches, so it makes it really easy to count. So once I have that done, I set to work knitting the garment. I will often rip out, go back, make changes. As I'm working, I'll go through 2 or 3 iterations through the process, which is totally normal. Now, the other thing that I do on the more instinctive side of the process, where I maybe don't use a notebook or do sketches or something like that, is I'll use formulas. And if it's something that I know already how to make that type of item, then I won't necessarily do a sketch or write down measurements or anything like that unless I need them. So for example, this is just a basic raglan sweater. I did not use pattern for this. I just cast on, and if you Google things like raglan sweater math or pie shawl math or crescent shawl math, it will give you the basic formulas that you need. And it will tell you when you do your raglans, you do your double increases on the front and back, and then you go a certain amount underneath the arm, and then you rejoin, you cast on a couple of stitches there, and then you continue knitting the body and the round, and then you go back and pick up the sleeves and continue from there. So I've used this basic template in order to make this sweater, my Montreal sweater that I made a few years ago. And then last year I added on to it to make it longer. I also used that same template to make my office sweater last year, and also the flamingo sweater that I just finished. So these are all the same formula, but they look drastically different. And something that I did much different on the flamingo sweater is I made the neckline significantly wider, and I did the contrasting sleeves. So when I was doing my raglan increases, what I did is, after I finished the collar, I put these collar stitches on hold. I knit the body, doing just 1 increase on each side of the front and back, and then joined for the underarm, knit the rest of the body. And then when I went back and picked up to the sleeve, from here to here, it's knit flat. And again, I just added an increase on each side so that it would match the body of the sweater, and it fit in neatly, and it got sewn up at the very end. So this does technically have seams in it, but they're very small seams. So the last thing that I want to mention about this process is that it's very important that you have accurate dimensions, and that you know your own dimensions. As I said, I sewed garments for myself long before I started knitting garments for myself. So I already have those dimensions written down. I have them saved for myself. So I know that if I'm knitting a sweater, I need X amount for the bust. I need X amount of length from the collar to the waistband, or from the collar to the hem. My armholes need to be a certain size, and I know what fits me and is most comfortable for me. And once I have that information, then it's very easy for me to just look at a photograph and say, okay, I like this style, and I will just recreate it for myself. And actually, one thing that I didn't mention early on, because I have somewhat non-traditional proportions, I have to alter any pattern that I make anyway, whether it's sewing, knitting, crochet. If it's something that is meant to be worn by me, I have to change it. I have extremely narrow shoulders, which means that if I'm sewing something like a jumper dress, what I need to do is make the neckline narrower. So I have to bring the shoulder straps or the neckline in, and then I have to raise it usually, because oftentimes necklines are just far too low on me. and then take the outer edge and raise that slightly so it actually hits my shoulder. I also have a larger bust, so I have to make bust adjustments. So from my perspective, as someone who is not good at math, it is generally easier for me to knit a swatch, to look at the yarn, look at the style, and say, okay, I know I'm getting 8 stitches to an inch, and I know that I need X number of inches. That means I have to cast on this number of stitches in order to make this fit my bust. And for me, that is easier than looking at a pattern or a schematic and saying, well, this doesn't fit me at all except in this one specific part, which means I need to change this, this, and this. So I have to do the conversion math for those 3 things. And when you change the measurement of one area, that might change the way another area fits. So for me, it's just easier to start from scratch using the photo as a reference than it is for me to go into a pattern and try to figure out where these changes start and end and how to convert them into something that actually works for me. This is just a process that works in my head. That's how my brain works. If that doesn't work for you and you like having that guidebook to follow, that's fine. Keep doing what you're doing. You don't have to do it my way. I just thought that I would try to explain it because I know that the way I work tends to confuse a lot of people. So to wrap this up, if I was going to give you a step-by-step guide on how to design something for yourself, either from a photo, from maybe you found a vintage pattern that you want to try, but the pattern is out of print and you can't find a copy somewhere, or you found a pattern you love, but it's not available in your language, what I would do is start with that photo, sketch it out, make yourself a schematic of how you think it's going to go together. Take all of your measurements really well. Make sure to add extra for ease if you want, or to take out a 1/2 inch or an inch for negative ease, however you want it to fit. Put all of those dimensions onto your schematic. Sketch out how you want it to look exactly. Swatch your yarns. Always swatch. I don't swatch very often, but that's because I only buy 2 weights of yarn pretty much exclusively. I pretty much only buy fingering weight yarn and worsted weight yarn. And the reason I do that is because, number one, it makes it easier to do color work. I know exactly on site which yarns are going to go together and which ones I can use together in the same project. It also means that I know at what gauge I like my fingering weight yarns to be knit up. And I know for socks, I like a size 1. For garments, I like a size 3 or a 4. And I know for worsted weight garments, what type of needle I need to use to get the type of fabric that I want. So it's already in my head. I have a system down, and I generally don't buy things like sport weight or DK because I can hold fingering double or hold it with one of my few skeins of lace weight yarn in order to get that weight if I want it for a project. It's not to say I don't buy them at all, but I buy them very seldom. It has to be a really great yarn that speaks to me in order for me to buy something that is sport weight or DK, and I don't really buy bulky weight yarn at all. So once you know what you want your final item to look like, you've got an idea of your swatch and your measurements, sit down and write out a little bit of a recipe for yourself. It doesn't have to be a line-by-line pattern, but like I said, just put down, how many inches of ribbing do you want? How long do you want the body of your sweater before you split for your sleeves? What is the circumference that you want on your hat or your mitts or whatever it is? And from there, you can start knitting or crocheting, whichever the case may be. And I'm going to give you 2 things that are really helpful with this other than just making notes as you go. The first is locking stitch markers. I keep this little vial of locking stitch markers, just the plastic ones, by my bed so that I always have them on hand. I also have a whole bunch of other ones that are just like progress keepers with a cute little charm on them. And anytime you do a decrease or an increase, or some kind of change to the size of the pattern, then put one of these in that spot so you can find it later. The other thing I'm going to recommend, which is something I got from a design book, I will leave the title of it down below. I don't remember the title off the top of my head, which is get the garage sale price tags from your local grocery store, stationery store, Dollar Tree, whatever. But it's the paper tags, and they have a little string on them. They're very small, only about that big. Hi, Morrigan. Get yourself a box of those, and when you make a change, especially if it's not in your preliminary pattern, write down what you did on the tag and put it with that stitch marker, so that way when you go back and change your notes, then you can go ahead and remember what you did, where you did it, how you did it, and it's all right there. And if it's something more complex, you can label those tags with something like A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, and then reference it in your notebook or in your notes wherever you're taking them, so that you know, okay, tag number 3, this is where I did this really complicated decrease that wouldn't fit on the tag when I was writing it out. One piece of advice that they give us as writers is that writing is rewriting. A good book is all about the editing and the revisions that go into it, and the same thing is true with knitting and pattern writing. You're going to be knitting and re-knitting and frogging and starting over and trying again before you get the final pattern. I had a completely finished sweater that I finished 2-3 years ago after ages and ages of knitting, and now I'm remaking it in a different yarn because I think I can do better and make it more wearable for myself. So like I said, knitting is re-knitting. You're going to go over things again and again, and that practice is so valuable. You're going to learn something every time you do it. Once you've got your final project, you've got your notes, you can write up your final pattern based on that information and then re-knit it again. If you're looking to publish your pattern, you need to re-knit it yourself at least one more time, as well as getting test knitters. If you're just doing this for yourself and want to have notes so that if you ever want to remake this item again in the future for a gift, or if something happens to the original, then that's fine. You can leave it as is, but make sure that your notes are legible and that you can understand all of your shorthand and all of your instructions. Otherwise, it's not going to do you any good in the future. The last thing I suggest is taking lots and lots of pictures, especially if you can get close-ups of any complicated items or points inside the pattern. That way, if you do decide to go to publication, you can have those references for your readers and buyers. And if you're just making notes for yourself and you want to go back and make it later, you can say, ah, yes, that is what that stitch pattern is. My instructions make sense now. So that is how I knit without a pattern. Those are my recommendations if you want to try doing it yourself. If you want something written out about this, I do have a full-length blog post listed on my website that I will link to down below that has all of this information in it. It is geared more towards writing patterns for publication, but it also applies if you just want to knit something for yourself and have those notes for future reference. Until next time, it would be a big help to me if you not only check out the website, but also my Ko-fi link. I also have a bunch of videos down below. If you like, share, interact with any of my work, it is a huge help for me, and it helps me find my readers and viewers on the internet. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope that you have something cute and fluffy to cuddle with. Not that bites.